The dust from the Wells Fargo stage had barely settled when two small figures emerged from behind the water trough outside Millfield's general store. Their dresses, once blue and yellow gingham, now bore the stains of 3 days on the trail without proper shelter. The older girl, maybe 12, clutched her sister's hand with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd learned too young that the world could be cruel. Her green eyes darted nervously between the townsfolk going about their business, searching for something or someone. The wooden sidewalks creaked under the boots of miners and cattlemen, but none paid attention to the two waifs who'd appeared like tumbleweeds blown in by the desert wind. Martha Whitmore adjusted her black shawl against the afternoon heat as she stepped out of Henderson's Mercantile, her weekly supplies bundled in brown paper. At 43, she'd been a widow for 2 years now, ever since consumption took her husband Samuel during the harsh winter of 1887. The loneliness sat heavy on her shoulders most days, made heavier by the empty chairs around her dinner table and the silence that filled her modest house on Elm Street. She'd learned to find purpose in small kindnesses, helping Doc Morrison with the church sick visits, bringing soup to the Kellys when their youngest took fever. But today, something in the desperate way those two girls pressed themselves against the storefront made her heart clench with recognition. "Please, ma'am," the older girl whispered as Martha approached, her voice barely audible above the clatter of wagon wheels on Main Street. "We ain't eaten in 2 days, and my sister Lucy here, she's feeling poorly." The child couldn't have been more than 8, her blonde curls matted and her face pale as morning milk. Martha's maternal instincts, dormant since Samuel's passing, stirred like embers finding fresh kindling. She'd seen that look before, in her own mirror during those first months of widowhood when pride warred with necessity. These girls carried themselves with the careful dignity of those who'd learned to be grateful for scraps while dreaming of something more. Sheriff Jake Morrison, no relation to the doc despite sharing a name, had been watching the girls from his office window for the better part of an hour. Something about their nervous glances and the way they kept to the shadows raised his lawman's instincts like hackles on a spooked horse. In his 15 years wearing the badge in Millfield, he'd learned to read trouble in the set of shoulders, the quickness of breath, the way eyes avoided direct contact. These weren't just hungry orphans looking for charity. The older one kept checking the road leading east, as if expecting pursuit, and her hand never strayed far from a small bundle tied to her waist. Experience had taught him that running children often carried more than just their belongings. Sometimes they carried secrets that could get good people hurt. The widow Mrs. Whitmore had always been the charitable sort, bless her heart, but charity without caution could be dangerous in territory where wanted posters changed as often as the weather. Just last month, the Pinkertons had come through asking about a family that had gone missing from a homestead near Tucson. Parents found dead, children vanished without a trace. The description had been vague, but 2 girls of the right ages traveling alone would certainly fit. Jake's hand unconsciously moved to rest on the worn grip of his Colt 45 as he watched Martha's face soften with that motherly concern that had made her beloved in the community, but also perhaps vulnerable to those who might exploit such kindness. "Lucy and I, we've been walking since our folks..." The older girl's voice cracked and she swallowed hard before continuing. "Since the fever took 'em near Prescott, we heard tell there might be work in Millfield, or maybe folks who'd take us in for chores and such." Her story sounded rehearsed, polished smooth by repetition, which made Martha's heart ache even more. Children shouldn't have to perfect their pleas for basic human kindness. The younger girl, Lucy, swayed slightly on her feet, and Martha instinctively reached out to steady her, feeling the child's fevered forehead beneath her palm. Whatever secrets these girls might be carrying, their immediate need was real enough. They were hungry, tired, and at least one was genuinely ill. Sheriff Morrison stepped down from the wooden sidewalk, his spurs ringing against the packed earth of Main Street. The afternoon sun caught the tin star on his vest as he approached, and Martha noticed how the older girl's spine stiffened like a cornered animal preparing to bolt. "Afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, touching the brim of his hat in polite greeting, his voice carefully neutral. "I couldn't help but notice you've made some new acquaintances." His grey eyes studied the children with professional assessment, taking in details that might prove important later, the quality of their worn shoes, the careful way the older girl positioned herself between him and her sister, the telltale bulge of something concealed beneath her tattered shawl. "Just 2 young ladies who've fallen on hard times, Sheriff," Martha replied, her tone carrying the gentle reproach of someone who'd spent her life caring for strays of both the human and animal variety. She'd always believed that kindness should be given freely, without interrogation or suspicion, a philosophy that had sometimes put her at odds with more cautious members of the community. Surely there's no harm in offering a meal and perhaps a place to wash up. But even as she spoke, Martha noticed the way the older girl's eyes darted between her and the sheriff, calculating distances and escape routes with the practiced efficiency of someone far too young to possess such survival instincts. The church bell began to toll 4 o'clock, its bronze voice carrying across the desert air like a prayer or a warning. In the distance, a dust cloud marked the approach of riders, too far yet to make out details, but moving fast enough to suggest urgency. Sheriff Morrison's eyes narrowed as he followed Martha's gaze toward the horizon, his hand sliding unconsciously toward his weapon. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, never taking his eyes from the approaching dust, "I think it might be best if you invited these young ladies inside for a spell, and perhaps you might consider joining them." The older girl's face had gone white as bleached bone, and she was already pulling her sister toward the narrow alley between buildings. Their pretense of casual conversation abandoned in the face of whatever approached from the east. "Please," the girl whispered, her composure finally cracking as the sound of hoofbeats began to echo off the buildings, still distant, but growing closer with each passing second. "Please, ma'am, we ain't done nothing wrong, but there's men who think we have, and they ain't the listening kind." Her young voice carried a weight of experience that made Martha's blood run cold. This child had seen violence, had learned to recognize its approach in the thunder of horses and the glint of metal in unforgiving hands. Sheriff Morrison was already moving, positioning himself between the girls and the street, his professional instincts overriding his suspicions as he recognized genuine terror in the child's eyes and calculated the odds of whatever was coming their way. Sheriff Morrison's weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he guided the small group toward the mercantile's back entrance, his mind racing through possibilities like cards in a high-stakes poker game. In his years keeping peace in Millfield, he'd learned that trouble rarely announced itself with brass bands. It usually crept in wearing the faces of desperate children or rode hard across the desert with revenge burning in its heart. The older girl, who'd whispered her name was Emma, moved with the careful grace of someone accustomed to staying invisible, but her sister Lucy stumbled with exhaustion and fever. Martha caught the younger child as she swayed, feeling the heat radiating through her thin dress like a small furnace, and her maternal instincts overrode any lingering caution about harboring strangers. "Inside quickly now," Martha murmured, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart as she hefted Lucy into her arms. The child weighed no more than a sack of grain, all sharp angles and fragile bones beneath skin that burned with sickness. Through the mercantile's dusty windows, she could see the dust cloud growing larger, resolving into the shapes of at least 4 riders pushing their mounts hard across the desert floor. Henderson, the store owner, looked up from his ledger with questioning eyes, but Martha's expression brooked no argument as she carried Lucy toward the store's small back room where bolt fabrics and supplies were kept. The smell of leather, tobacco, and dried goods couldn't mask the tension that crackled in the air like the moments before a thunderstorm. Emma pressed herself against the wall beside the window, her small frame trembling with more than just fear as she watched the approaching riders. "That's Caleb Thornton leading them," she whispered, her voice carrying the bitter knowledge of someone who'd learned to identify danger from a distance. "He's got a bounty notice, says we stole his gold, but that ain't the truth of it." Her green eyes, old beyond their years, met Sheriff Morrison's steady gaze with desperate honesty. "My pa found that gold fair and square, panning in Willow Creek, but Thornton claimed the whole area was his by right of some paper he bought in Phoenix." The injustice in her voice rang true, but Morrison had heard enough sob stories from both sides of the law to know that truth often wore many faces in the territory. "Your father's dead, you said?" Morrison asked quietly, positioning himself where he could watch both the front street and the back alley, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. The gesture wasn't lost on Emma, who nodded while her fingers unconsciously traced the outline of something hidden beneath her shawl. "Fever took him and Ma both 2 weeks back. Before he died, Pa made me promise to take what was ours and find somewhere safe for Lucy and me." Her young face hardened with determination that would have been admirable in a grown woman and was heartbreaking in a child. "Thornton showed up the day after we buried them, claiming squatters' rights and demanding we turn over everything Pa had saved." The bitter edge in her voice suggested the confrontation hadn't ended with polite conversation. Martha cradled Lucy closer, feeling the child's fevered breathing against her neck as she listened to Emma's story unfold like a dime novel come to life. She'd heard similar tales before, territorial disputes that turned ugly when grief and greed collided in the lawless spaces between established towns. "What exactly did your father find, child?" she asked gently, though part of her dreaded the answer. Gold had a way of bringing out the worst in men, turning neighbors into enemies, and transforming simple folk into something desperate and dangerous. Outside, the hoofbeats were growing louder, and she could make out individual voices calling to each other as the riders spread out to search the town. The sound made her skin crawl with memories of other times when armed men had come looking for things that didn't belong to them. Sheriff Morrison's jaw tightened as he recognized Caleb Thornton's voice above the others, barking orders like a man accustomed to being obeyed. Thornton owned the biggest spread east of Millfield and had a reputation for settling disputes with lead rather than law when it suited his purposes. The man had always skirted the edges of legal behavior, using his wealth and influence to avoid consequences that would have landed lesser men in jail or worse. "How much gold are we talking about, Emma?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from the way the child's hand protectively covered her hidden bundle. "Enough to make Thornton ride hard across 50 miles of desert, apparently." The sheriff's estimation of the situation grew grimmer with each passing moment. Emma's resolve wavered for just an instant, her child's need for protection warring with the fierce independence that had kept her and Lucy alive on the trail. "Pa found a vein in Willow Creek that assayed pure as anything the mines in Colorado ever produced," she admitted, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "He spent months working it quiet-like, not telling nobody, building up enough to maybe buy us a real place somewhere." The dreams in her voice, of a home, of safety, of the normal childhood she'd never had, made Martha's heart ache with recognition. Every woman in the territory knew what it meant to build castles from hope and watch them crumble when hard men with harder hearts decided to take what wasn't theirs. The back door of the mercantile rattled under someone's fist, and Henderson called out nervously, "Store's closed for the day," but the pounding continued, accompanied by Thornton's gravelly voice demanding entry. "We're looking for 2 young girls, Henderson. Word is they might have sought shelter in your establishment." Sheriff Morrison caught Martha's eye and nodded toward a narrow staircase that led to Henderson's small living quarters above the store. The old merchant, despite his nervous demeanor, had always been a decent man who understood that some situations called for bending rules rather than breaking spirits. Without a word, he moved to unlock the back door while Morrison positioned himself where he'd have a clear view of whoever entered. Lucy stirred in Martha's arms, her fevered eyes focusing with difficulty on the commotion around her. "Emma," she whispered, her small voice cutting through the tension like a knife through fabric. "Are the bad men here?" The innocent question carried such weight of prior trauma that Martha felt tears prick her eyes. These children had seen too much, endured too much, for ones so young to carry such fear in their hearts. Emma moved to her sister's side, taking her small hand and squeezing gently. "Don't you worry none, Lucy. The nice lady and the sheriff, they're gonna help us." But the uncertainty in Emma's voice suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as comfort her sister. The sound of spurs on wooden floors announced Thornton's entry, followed by the heavier tread of his men, spreading through the store like wolves scenting prey. Sheriff Morrison stepped into view, his badge catching the afternoon light that slanted through the windows, his presence filling the doorway between the main store and the back room where the others waited. "Afternoon, Thornton," he said evenly, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of facing down troublemakers of every stripe. "Mighty far from your usual range, aren't you?" The challenge in his tone was subtle but unmistakable, a reminder that Millfield fell under Morrison's jurisdiction and that some behaviors wouldn't be tolerated, regardless of a man's wealth or reputation. Caleb Thornton filled the mercantile's narrow doorway like a storm cloud, his expensive boots and silver-trimmed hat marking him as a man who'd found ways to prosper while others scratched out bare survival from the unforgiving territory soil. Behind him, 3 hard-faced men spread through Henderson's store with the casual arrogance of those accustomed to taking what they wanted without consequence. "Sheriff Morrison," Thornton drawled, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a snake oil salesman mixed with the underlying menace of a rattlesnake coiled to strike. "I'm tracking 2 young thieves who made off with property belonging to me. Word from the stage driver says they got off right here in your peaceful little town." His cold eyes swept the store's interior, searching for any sign of his quarry, while his men began systematically examining hiding places behind barrels and beneath counters. "That's a serious accusation, Thornton," Morrison replied, his hand resting with deceptive casualness on his gun belt as he studied the 4 men who'd invaded his jurisdiction. "You got papers to back up this claim? Some kind of legal document that gives you authority to hunt children across county lines?" The sheriff's voice carried the dry skepticism of a man who'd heard too many tall tales from men with flexible relationships with truth. Behind him, Martha pressed herself against the wall of the back room, Lucy's fevered breathing the only sound that betrayed their presence. Emma stood frozen beside them, her young face pale with the recognition that their brief moment of safety was crumbling like sandcastles before an incoming tide. Thornton's laugh held no warmth as he produced a folded paper from his vest pocket, smoothing it out with theatrical precision. "Got myself a legal claim to the Willow Creek area, purchased fair and square from the territorial office in Phoenix last month. Any gold taken from that land belongs to me by right of ownership." The document looked official enough, complete with stamps and signatures, but Morrison had seen enough forged papers in his time to maintain his skepticism. "Of course, the real crime here ain't just theft. It's what those girls did to earn that gold in the first place." His implication hung in the air like gun smoke, poisonous and designed to turn any sympathy for the children into suspicion. Emma's sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but it carried the weight of understanding what Thornton's accusation could mean for her and Lucy. In the territory, where law was often decided by whoever had the fastest draw or the most convincing story, the reputation of orphaned children carried little weight against the word of a wealthy landowner. "That's a lie," she whispered, though her voice lacked the strength to carry beyond the back room where they huddled like cornered animals. Martha felt the child's trembling increase and instinctively tightened her protective embrace around both girls. The widow had seen enough of life's cruelties to recognize when powerful men decided to destroy the innocent to protect their own interests. "You're suggesting these children committed murder for gold?" Sheriff Morrison's voice cut through Thornton's insinuations like a blade through silk, sharp and deadly in its precision. The accusation changed everything. Theft was one matter, but murder would make the girls fugitives from territorial justice, rather than simply desperate orphans seeking shelter. Morrison's experienced lawman's instincts told him that Thornton was spinning a web of lies, but in the absence of witnesses or evidence, it might be a web strong enough to trap 2 defenseless children. "That's quite a leap from property theft, Thornton. You got any proof to back up such a serious charge?" Thornton's smile revealed teeth yellowed by tobacco and sharpened by years of getting his way through intimidation and wealth. "Found their parents shot dead in their cabin, Sheriff. Looked like someone surprised them while they were counting their ill-gotten gains. The girls disappeared that same night, along with every speck of gold that rightfully belonged to me." His story was plausible enough to give even Morrison pause. Desert justice was swift and often final when it came to claim jumpers and thieves. "I'm thinking maybe those sweet little innocents got tired of watching their daddy steal what wasn't his and decided to take matters into their own hands." The calculated cruelty of the accusation made Martha's blood run cold as she realized how easily such a story might be believed by those who didn't know the truth. Henderson, who'd been listening from behind his counter with growing distress, finally found his voice. "Now see here, Thornton, there ain't no call to be making such accusations without proof. Those girls looked half-starved and scared out of their wits when they arrived. Don't seem like the behavior of cold-blooded killers to me." The storekeeper's defense carried the weight of genuine outrage, but also the tremor of a man who knew he was risking his own safety by opposing someone with Thornton's reputation. His words provided a moment of hope that flickered like a candle flame in a windstorm, fragile but precious in its defiance of the darkness threatening to engulf Emma and Lucy. Sheriff Morrison's mind raced through possibilities as he weighed the evidence before him, or rather the lack of it. Thornton's story was convenient, perhaps too convenient, painting himself as the wronged victim while transforming 2 orphaned children into murderous thieves. But in the territory, convenience often trumped truth when backed by enough money and influence. "Tell you what, Thornton," Morrison said finally, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man buying time to think. "Why don't you and your boys head over to the saloon for some refreshment while I conduct a proper search of the premises? If these girls are here, I'll find them, and we can sort this whole matter out according to law rather than vigilante justice." The suggestion clearly didn't sit well with Thornton, whose eyes narrowed with the suspicion of a man accustomed to getting immediate satisfaction for his demands. "I'd prefer to oversee this search personally, Sheriff. These children are dangerous, and I wouldn't want any of your fine citizens getting hurt if they're cornered and desperate." His concern sounded genuine enough to an untrained ear, but Morrison heard the underlying threat. If he didn't produce the girls quickly, Thornton might decide to take matters into his own hands. The tension in the small store stretched taut as a bowstring, with everyone present understanding that the next few moments would determine whether justice or vengeance would carry the day. Behind the thin wall that separated them from discovery, Emma made a decision that would change everything. Her small hand moved to the bundle at her waist, fingers working quickly to untie the leather strings that held her father's legacy. "Mrs. Whitmore," she whispered, pressing something heavy and metallic into Martha's free hand while keeping Lucy close. "Here's what he's really after. Every nugget and flake Pa found in that creek. If something happens to Lucy and me, you make sure folks know the truth about how Pa died." The weight of the gold seemed to burn Martha's palm as she realized she now held the evidence that could either save these children or condemn them, depending on how Sheriff Morrison chose to interpret Thornton's increasingly dangerous accusations. The weight of Emma's gold seemed to pulse in Martha's palm like a living thing, each nugget representing not wealth, but the love of a dying father desperate to secure his daughter's future. As Thornton's men began overturning barrels and checking behind every conceivable hiding place, Martha made a decision that surprised even herself. She stepped into the main store, Lucy still in her arms, and faced down the most powerful man in 3 counties, with nothing but righteous fury and a widow's protective instincts. "Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice carrying across the cluttered space like a church bell calling the faithful to account for their sins, "I believe you're looking for something that doesn't belong to you." The sudden appearance of the woman and fevered child brought every conversation to a halt, creating a tableau of tension that crackled with unspoken threats and desperate hopes. Sheriff Morrison's eyes widened as Martha stepped forward, but he quickly recognized the steel in her spine that had helped her survive 2 years of widowhood in unforgiving country. Emma emerged from behind her, small but defiant, her chin raised with the kind of courage that only comes from having nothing left to lose. "That gold in your hand, Mrs. Whitmore," Thornton said, his voice dangerously soft, "was stolen from my claim by a family of murderous thieves. I'll be taking it back now, along with these 2 killers who need to face territorial justice." But Martha didn't flinch, didn't step aside, didn't show any of the fear that lesser souls might have displayed when confronted by armed men used to getting their way through intimidation and violence. "The only murderer in this room," Martha declared, her voice growing stronger with each word, "is the man who killed John and Sarah Miller for the crime of finding honest gold on unclaimed land." The accusation hit Thornton like a physical blow, and for just a moment his composed mask cracked to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. Emma gasped at hearing her parents' names spoken aloud, while Lucy stirred weakly in Martha's arms, her fevered eyes focusing on the man who'd made them orphans. "That's right, girls," Martha continued, her gaze never leaving Thornton's face. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned seeing strange riders heading toward Willow Creek 3 weeks ago. Riders who matched the description of you and your men, Mr. Thornton." The lie flowed smoothly from her lips, a calculated gamble designed to shake his confidence. Sheriff Morrison's hand moved closer to his gun as he watched Thornton's composure continue to crumble under Martha's unexpected assault. The wealthy rancher's men shifted uncomfortably, suddenly uncertain about the righteousness of their cause as the widow's accusations painted their employer in an increasingly dark light. "You got no proof of such wild claims, woman," Thornton snarled, but his voice carried the edge of desperation rather than righteous indignation. "These children are wanted for murder, and I aim to see justice done." Yet even as he spoke, Morrison noticed how Thornton's eyes kept darting toward the door, calculating distances and escape routes like a man who suddenly found himself trapped rather than triumphant. Emma stepped forward, her young voice cutting through the tension with unexpected strength. "He came to our cabin the night after we buried Ma and Pa," she said, her words carrying the ring of absolute truth. "Said he'd bought the rights to Willow Creek and everything on it. When Pa refused to hand over what he'd rightfully found, Thornton shot him down like a dog." Tears streamed down her face, but her voice never wavered as she continued her testimony. "Then he killed Ma when she tried to protect Lucy and me. We only got away because I grabbed Pa's rifle and put a bullet close enough to his ear to make him duck." The image of a 12-year-old girl holding off armed killers with a rifle nearly as tall as herself sent a chill through every person in the store. The truth hung in the air like smoke from a gunfight, impossible to ignore or explain away. Sheriff Morrison had heard enough conflicting stories in his career to recognize genuine trauma when he saw it, and Emma's account had the unpolished authenticity that no amount of rehearsing could fake. "Thornton," he said quietly, his hand now resting openly on his gun butt, "I think you and your boys had better start riding before I decide to wire the territorial marshal about some missing persons from Willow Creek." The threat was clear, backed by the authority of the badge and the growing certainty that he'd been fed a pack of lies designed to cover up cold-blooded murder. Martha felt a surge of relief as she realized the tide was finally turning in favor of justice over influence. But Thornton wasn't finished yet. With the desperate fury of a cornered animal, he made a grab for his weapon, apparently deciding that if he couldn't have the gold legally, he'd take it by force and eliminate the witnesses who could testify against him. The sound of leather sliding against metal filled the small store as hands moved toward guns, but Sheriff Morrison's years of experience gave him the edge he needed. His Colt cleared leather a fraction of a second before Thornton's, the metallic click of the hammer cocking back, freezing everyone in place. "I wouldn't," Morrison said calmly, his gun steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Millfield's got a nice quiet cemetery, but I'd hate to have to explain to the territorial governor why I had to plant one of his prominent citizens there." The standoff stretched for an eternity measured in heartbeats, with Thornton's men calculating whether their loyalty was worth dying for and finding it wanting. One by one, they raised their hands and stepped back from their weapons, leaving their employer isolated in his desperation. Henderson had the presence of mind to gather up the scattered firearms, while Martha clutched both girls protectively, her own heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. "Smart choice, boys," Morrison said approvingly, never taking his eyes or his gun off Thornton. "Now, Mr. Thornton, you're going to mount up and ride out of my town, and you're going to keep riding until you're back on your own spread. If I see you in Millfield again, I'll assume you're here to cause more trouble, and I'll act accordingly." The aftermath came swiftly. Once Thornton and his men had been escorted to their horses and sent packing with explicit warnings about the consequences of returning, Martha found herself the temporary guardian of 2 orphaned girls and a considerable amount of gold that would ensure their future comfort and security. Emma's fever broke that night in Martha's spare bedroom, and Lucy began to recover under the widow's patient care and Doc Morrison's ministrations. The gold, when properly assayed, proved to be worth enough to buy a modest ranch or send both girls to finishing school back east. But as Martha watched Emma reading stories to her recovering sister in the front parlor, she realized that what they'd really found was something far more valuable than gold. They'd found each other, and they'd found a home. As autumn painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Martha Whitmore's house on Elm Street no longer echoed with loneliness, but rang with the laughter of children who'd learned to trust again. Emma had grown into the role of big sister and helper, with grace beyond her years, while Lucy's natural cheerfulness returned as her health improved and her nightmares faded. Sheriff Morrison stopped by regularly, ostensibly to check on the family's welfare, but really because he'd found in Martha a kindred spirit who understood that sometimes the law needed to be tempered with mercy and justice seasoned with compassion. And if the townsfolk noticed that the widow's smile had returned and her step had regained its spring, they were wise enough to understand that some stories of redemption were too precious to analyze too closely, content instead to witness the miracle of 3 broken hearts learning to beat as one.